Welcome to the TeenTix Arts Podcast, also known as TAP, a Seattle-based youth podcast that focuses on empowering youth voices through the exploration of art. Here on this podcast, we share our favorite artistic topics by exploring their histories and cultural impacts, but not only by offering our perspective as teens. We interview artists, from emerging teen artists to ones well established in their careers. Hi, I'm Ashwari.
I'm Olivia, and today we're going to be talking about something that I'm sure everyone has studied in school at some point, and that is Shakespeare. But specifically, we're going to be talking about how Shakespeare's work is adapted and whether those adaptations are still relevant to modern audiences. Ashwari, how were you first introduced to Shakespeare?
For me, it was 12th night in 6th grade. I remember reading it and then getting to act out a scene from the play. I actually loved learning about Shakespeare in this way because I got to see the words on the page and then, speak them out loud. It really set the stage for my excitement for and love of Shakespeare later on, especially because it's a less serious play and has a really fun, engaging plot, especially to an 11-year-old. I loved how reading Shakespeare felt like being transported to a past or a fantastical new world with new language and mannerisms. For my 11-year-old mind, decoding his lines honestly felt like solving some fun puzzles.
It's funny, I was also introduced to Shakespeare through 12th Night in middle school, but I did not like decoding his lines. I did not like the fun puzzles. I think I was just kind of annoyed that we were focusing so much on like this random English guy from hundreds of years ago, and I was like, I like the modern books that I'm reading now. Why are we focusing on this guy? And I think that once I then acted in Shakespeare, I enjoyed it a lot more, but initially I did not like Shakespeare at all when I was introduced to it in middle school.
It's so cool that we both have connections to 12th Night. That's such a nice coincidence. But now I'm curious, do you have any favorite specific adaptations?
I do. I think I've mentioned them before on the podcast, but I will reiterate because these are some of my favorite plays that I've ever seen. But I saw Teenage Dick at the Seattle Rep. I don't remember what year it was, but it was a couple years ago. It was an adaptation of Richard III, and the character of Richard is rewritten as a teenager who has cerebral palsy. It touches on issues like ableism and bullying. It's like one of the best representations of a disabled character that I've personally ever seen. I really love this show. I would highly recommend it if it's ever playing near you. And then another show I saw also at the Seattle Rep is Fat Ham, which is an adaptation of Hamlet. It takes place at like a family cookout. And what's interesting about that show is it sort of takes the plot of Hamlet and just flips it on its head and says, why don't we just do this a different way? Which is really kind of a fun way to adapt Shakespeare, is to sort of just challenge the entire plot. And it has one of the greatest covers of Creep by Radiohead that I have ever witnessed. And for that reason, you must see this play if you can. And so those are two of my favorite Shakespeare adaptations. But do you have a favorite?
Yeah, I definitely do, but I'm definitely not as familiar with theater adaptations as you are, though those sound amazing. The adaptations that I know a little bit about are movies, and curiously, they're both rom-coms. I really like She's the Man and 10 Things I Hate About You. Funny story, I actually only found out about 10 Things I Hate About You being an adaptation of Shakespeare really recently as I was doing research. And I honestly would have never guessed that it is a Shakespeare adaptation because it feels so high school rom com and not historical like drama theater at all. But I went into She's the Man knowing it's an adaptation of my favorite Shakespeare play, Twelfth Night. So I had a lot of fun comparing plot details with the original. And I felt that the ways that the filmmakers adapted the plot to fit, like a modern rom com storyline was super entertaining. And I really think they did a good job. But honestly, I'm so desperate to see a theater adaptation sometime soon. So now let's talk a little bit about Shakespeare adaptations and the history behind them. According to No Sweat Shakespeare, interestingly, some Shakespeare adaptations began because a few people felt the need to improve the plays, going so far as to even rewrite some major parts. Another reason for quote unquote adapting Shakespeare is to censor them in a sense. This started with a guy named Thomas Bowdler as he attempted to make the plays more suitable for children. Of course, the plays have also been adapted to be more inclusive. The Royal Shakespeare Company, as per the London Magazine, has famously placed emphasis on providing new backgrounds to the plots. Some examples include Much Ado About Nothing in modern day India and Julius Caesar in an African country. A direct quote from the article explains why this is so important. Quote, adaptation thus provides an opportunity for Shakespeare to be translated to other cultures, both in linguistic and cultural terms, end quote.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that one of the reasons I love Shakespeare adaptations is because they can speak to modern issues by just changing the setting sometimes. Like sometimes that's all they do, and even just that can really change the story. But since we're already talking about history, I wanted to take a little bit of a left turn because while researching for this episode, I learned about some conspiracy theories regarding Shakespeare. Have you ever heard of these?
No, I don't think so, but that sounds really cool. What are they?
Well, I kind of heard about two, most talked about conspiracy theories. The first is just that Shakespeare didn't actually write Shakespeare. He was kind of just a deadbeat actor, and that someone used his name. And people often will say that it was Francis Bacon or the 17th Earl of Oxford. There was even, a mock Supreme Court trial with Supreme Court justices in 1987 where they were like, yeah, it doesn't seem like there's definitely a chance that it's not actually Shakespeare, which I'm like, guys, don't you have more important things? Actually, maybe they should stay focused on that. Maybe we should keep them focused on that. This kind of take on a Shakespeare conspiracy theory is like the criticism that I've heard about it is that it's quite classist because the assumption is that, well, a glovemaker's son from Stratford-upon-Avon couldn't possibly have had the education or literary taste to be writing these great plays. So I think that you can kind of sort of dismiss those theories as classist, especially because Shakespeare scholars, they really reject these conspiracy theories as conspiracies. There's not really any significant scholarship to support them. But I think a more interesting conspiracy theory about Shakespeare is that he was actually a woman who stole Shakespeare's identity in order to publish plays because women weren't allowed to be writing plays at this time. So there's an obvious reason why stealing someone else's name. People will sometimes say this explains why there are well-written female characters in Shakespeare, and they'll kind of point to certain lines about female rage or talking about women's position in society and be like, only a woman could have written this, which I kind of understand. There was an Elizabethan literary critic who was talking about this female writer who was so incredible in the same year that Shakespeare's name first appeared in print. So some people will point to that as oh, maybe it's this woman who stole Shakespeare's identity. Ultimately, there's not a ton of scholarship to support that either, but I do think it's an interesting thought experiment.
Yeah, I definitely think that's also interesting, especially the part about well-written female characters. I definitely noticed that when I was reading Twelfth Night because I remember especially Viola's monologue felt like it was so, well-written, and it kind of represented a female character really well. So that was definitely a great left turn that you took. Do you believe in any of these theories, though?
Not really. I mean, I don't know a ton about Shakespeare, but I think it is cool to think about, to use this as an avenue to think about women playwrights back then, because they definitely existed. Women were writing plays, I'm sure. And I think you can appreciate that fact without assuming that Shakespeare was a woman. What I don't understand quite as much, though, is why Shakespeare's stories have survived this long and are still being adapted.
Yeah, well, simply put, I think it's due to the fact that the themes present and emotions that characters exhibit in his plays are so universal and, as stated by Arcadia Quill, timeless. And past this, the plots themselves seem to resonate with modern situations to a certain extent, even more so than they may seem at first glance.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's value in Shakespeare's plays because the plots are relatively simple and well-known human experiences, so projecting modern experiences and issues onto them is pretty easy. And I mean, sometimes you don't even have to reach very far. I've mentioned before on the podcast how Twelfth Night can very easily be read through a queer lens. the subtext is right in front of us and all you have to do is lean into it. So sometimes it's not very difficult. Honestly, though, I'm wondering how exactly Shakespeare has been adapted so much. Like, is there some kind of outline or format or like way to adapt Shakespeare?
Good question. The answer is kind of. So let's take a look at the how to portion of adaptations. As outlined by Adapting Shakespeare, a how to guide from Spark Magazine, there are three key components to adapting Shakespeare. The first one is to lean into the comedy. Spark Magazine uses She's the Man, a film adaptation of Twelfth Night, as I mentioned before, as an example for this part. The movie succeeds as an adaptation because of its use of the original situational humor specifically, of disguise and intricate love triangles. The second component is to flesh out all of the characters, not just the protagonist. For this one, let's look at what the magazine said about 10 Things I Hate About You. In this movie, we can see how Patrick, Cameron, Katerina, and Bianca are all complicated and developed, even to the point where a single protagonist doesn't even seem that visible. And the third and last component is don't rely too much on the source material. Contrary to what we might think, Spark Magazine states that while narrative and characters are good to keep the same, take creative liberties and shift things around for the context of the adaptation, especially if it's set in, a different time period or country. So don't be rigidly stuck to the original elements and really have fun with it. But I'm sure you'd love to know more about adaptations and how they're made. So let's talk to some folks who have tangible experience with adapting Shakespeare.
All right, so I'm here with two like young upstart up and coming theater people, and I'd love to start by having you guys introduce yourselves. Ella, do you want to go first and just share your name and what you do in the theater space?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ella Avital. I'm a second year at the UW. Still young though. Don't worry about me. Sorry. Yeah, so I go to UW and I am a actor and director in UW drama spaces, I guess. Currently I'm acting in a UW drama production, but in the fall I directed my first ever production. And that was super, super fun. That was for UTS, which is the Undergraduate Theater Society. And yeah, it was the time of my life. I loved it.
And fun fact, UTS has a TeenTix relationship, so teens can
Yes.
get $5 tickets.
Yes, they can.
Hi, my name is Chance Kelly. I'm a first year here at the University of Washington. I'm studying drama and philosophy. I am an actor and a director, but although not yet here at UW. Ella, I had no idea you directed a show. That's so cool.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, it was really underground, really chill. I wouldn't expect you to have known about it.
yeah, no, I did actually happen to play Macbeth in Ella Avital's Macbeth in the fall.
Yeah, and I feel like we should clarify that none of us are in a theater right now, so it is appropriate for us to
Super
Yes.
say
very chill, very
Yes.
chill.
Macbeth. Normally, I
Yes.
would be much more careful, but we're all
Lee, McBizzle, the Scottish
yeah.
Mackers.
Hmm.
Mackers.
No, we're all
Um,
good.
yeah. Well, thanks so much for introducing yourselves. And as you guys kind of mentioned, what we mostly wanted to talk about today was the production of Macbeth that Ella you directed and Chance you starred in. Um, because this episode we're talking about Shakespeare, about adapting Shakespeare, and kind of about how to keep Shakespeare relevant, or maybe you don't think it's relevant anymore, and you don't think that it should keep being produced. But yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So if we could start, Ella, I just wanted to hear like a little bit about the production of Macbeth that you did last fall, why you chose it, what the directing experience was like, and just a little bit of that.
Um, so at the beginning of last year, my dear, great, and lovely friend Connor Zamora told me that UTS was opening up their director's applications, and I'd always wanted to direct, and I wanted to jump right into the club, to the RSO, and so I was figuring out how, like, applying and what I could potentially do. And I love Shakespeare. I've always loved Shakespeare ever since I was a kid. Just I think that I see it as it's just so cool that it's been around for so long and that somebody's work and somebody's art and something that Shakespeare wrote hundreds of years ago is still um, relevant today. And it's stories that people can still relate to and still laugh at and still find a lot of enjoyment and excitement from. So I've always loved Shakespeare. And I kind of was like, I would really like to do a Shakespeare. I'd love to direct it. Um, it's a lot cheaper because you don't have to pay for rights, but it's also just super fun to really like jump into um, Shakespearean text and characters that have been around forever and to put your own spin on it. And when I was in high school, I the first ever Shakespeare I ever acted in was Macbeth, and I played Lady Macbeth, and it was first of all like just an insanely fun production, and the first time I felt like I was challenged as an actor, and it was the first time I felt like a director really like wanted me to push myself and to be as good as I could be. Um, and I will never forget that experience. Super huge to me as an actor and going forward for the rest of my life. When I was deciding what I wanted to direct, I was looking at Shakespeare and I was jumping between a few different options. And then my friend was like, "What if you tried Macbeth and like you said it in the 70s? Like, what if it was like mobster?" And I was like, "Wait, that would be so awesome and so cool." And I already had that really strong connection to Macbeth, and I knew the text and I knew the script a lot better than I knew a lot of other Shakespearean productions. And so I was like, yeah, I mean, the first one that I acted in was Macbeth. Might as well be the first one I directed. And the mobster idea too, like that really like that was like a lighting a match, and it just like immediately I started seeing exactly what it could be, and I started having this like these really strong visions and ideas, and so I just kind of let that take me wherever I wanted to go, and yeah.
No, that was great. I like can kind of relate to that. I feel like doing 12th night when I was in high school was kind of also for me the first time I was like,
Mhm.
wait, I can actually like dig into this and like really like
Yeah,
act, like
yeah.
be a real actor who like does like prep work and
Mhm.
like subtext of all the lines.
Yeah,
On that
totally.
topic, Chance, can you talk a little bit about what it was like from the acting perspective to do Shakespeare, which is like I think can be perceived as challenging because it's so old and it's kind of like a different language, but what was that experience like for you?
Um, it was both incredibly awesome and incredibly rough. I had done Shakespeare in smaller increments before. Like I've had to do monologues, and I did this thing called the Shakespeare Summer Stroll. Back in my hometown of yeah, I didn't grow up in Santa Rosa, but it did happen in Santa Rosa. And shout out Santa Rosa, big SR. And it was just like a whole bunch of little scenes, and I kind of just did it, and it was a really tight time frame, and I was just like, I have no idea what I'm saying. And I would go to Macbeth rehearsals, and I would just kind of go through the motions. I'd be like, okay, I'm kind of memorized on this, and I'm going to do it in a way that I think is entertaining. And then Ella would be like, hey, what are you saying right now? And I'd be like, I have no idea. And it was a lot of that. It was a lot of like just trying to work around what the words actually mean. But then at some point it clicks, and you realize that in one sentence you're able to manipulate three people at the same time, talk about your relationship with your wife, give a grand plan, and also like a greater philosophy on your view of life, all in just one sentence. And it's hard, but it is like, I don't want to sound like every actor, but it's such a joy. It's like so much fun because there is like, it's complicated poetry and it's ancient and it's like so needlessly complicated sometimes. But on the other hand, there is just so much to chew on. Like it's gum. Oh my God. It is really, really, really fun.
Yeah, I feel the same. Um, Ella, you can probably speak to this and maybe Chance you can as well, but I'm curious like what the would you say it was 1970s mobster? What did that like bring to the script? Do you feel like that changed any of the themes of the show at all? And if so, like how? Either of you could jump on
Both like if they're not going to see our faces, but we're both like
that.
jumping around because we're so excited to talk about it because nobody asked us these questions during the show, and the two of us spent like hours on this during fall quarter, Chance and I spent like at least minimum of like 4 hours a
18
day
hours a day, every single
literally we were
day.
together all the time, and I was like, God, what is going on? But it was a beautiful time, and it was really fun. um I think that number one, Macbeth is super interesting in that like it can kind of be set in literally any time period with like a government or a democracy or a non-democratic government. And it has a lot of really interesting themes about power and greed and um, succession, and that was really really fun to tackle. But I think also like a big thing that I found and that a lot of the cast found in the script was like violence and cycles of violence, and
Mm.
interestingly enough, like masculinity. And there was
Hmm.
a lot to say about masculinity in the script, which is super interesting because a lot of there's an interesting culture in, I'm sure, um m- mobs and in like, I guess, I don't know if gang culture is the right word, but um obviously you see back in the 70s in New York City there was pretty strong gender roles and
Hmm.
pretty strong expectations of people based off of their gender identity. And we found a lot of really interesting, I'm going to sound like such a jerk when I say this, but like we found a lot of interesting like play and intention and motivation behind a lot of those themes of like, um, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman?
Mm.
Um, what is the difference between violence against a man versus violence against a woman? There's a whole line in like the end of Act Two where Macduff, um, his wife and children are murdered by Macbeth, and then and then another man, Malcolm, goes to him and he goes like, "Let this be the whetstone of your grief, and like, um, let it fuel you. Let this anger fuel you, and
Mm.
like act on it. Do something. Be a man." And then Macduff says, "I shall do so, but I must also feel it as a man." Which, like, I don't really think
Whoa.
Shakespearean audiences were like, "Oh, that's so beautiful." But I got to be in the audience and watch the audience receive that line, and every single time they were like, "Oh, oh my God, yeah, feel it as a man." Like,
Mm.
have that emotion and have that experience, and like, don't stop yourself from feeling that grief. So there, it was really interesting to see not only like putting the script into a modern context, but also putting it in front of a modern audience and to
Hmm.
have people take things away from that. It was also really fun that this is like a lighter, sillier note, but we like, there's a whole scene where um the three witches are like showing Macbeth a prophecy, and we had them like high on drugs instead of like actually being like witches. They were just like these street urchins that were like smoking a joint, and then they were like, "You want to see something crazy?" to Macbeth, and they gave him cocaine, which was like inappropriate. But it was really fun to bring that into a modern context. And audiences, it was interesting to see how audiences connected with that interpretation. If that
Mm. Yeah.
answered your question,
No,
I
that
don't know.
totally did. That's really interesting, and it kind of connects to what we were talking about when we were talking about Shakespeare adaptations on this podcast. In that, like, a lot of what Shakespeare writes about gender in a lot of his plays, it feels very modern, and so you're like, why is this dude in like ye olden days like so like woke about gender roles? And it's actually led to like people questioning whether Shakespeare was really a man or if it was like a woman like taking on Shakespeare's persona. Which I don't know is just kind of an interesting thought experiment because like my favorite play, 12th Night, there's so much of that where you're like, wow, like this woman has like is like cross-dressing as a man and being perceived as a man and experiencing the world as a man, but has been raised as a woman. And so like there's interesting things in that play too, but yeah, what do you think, Chance? Were there any like things that really stood out to you like bringing it into a modern context?
I would say that just on the topic of gender, there was enough that stuck out to me that I took a Shakespeare class in the winter last quarter, and I
Mhm.
wrote my entire 10-page final essay on just the two lines. Um, but first, I may feel it as a man from Macduff, and Lady Macbeth in early in the show where she says, unsex me here in order to commit crazy acts of violence. Um, and so there's so many tiny lines like that, which, you know, happen in a moment, that is what makes Shakespeare, but also Macbeth specifically, so timeless. Um, and I think that I really appreciated what we did in our show, in that we could have, you know, like, I talk about my theater teacher from high school all the time. Shout out James Thomas Bailey. And
Shout out
uh,
James.
shout out JTB. And he always says, like, it's impossible to do a true adaptation of Shakespeare in the modern day because everyone wants like their own take on it. And like the
Mm.
70s mobster stuff was our own take on it. And I really appreciate that we were able to give our take on it. Because it's not bad to have an original take on Shakespeare, but we never like characterized it. It wasn't like, nah, see, it was like, hey, let's talk about the awful things that come with this kind of like aesthetic of a show, like these cycles of violence and this like gender based violence and like betrayal and like killing your brothers and like awful things. And all of it reflected really nicely in Macbeth. And on the flip side, added another level of things for us as actors to pay attention to. I don't think Ella's talked about this yet, but um, she rewrote the play slightly so that the people who get killed, who have like the most violence like put upon them, were made into female characters, like Banquo, and Macduff's son was
Mm.
turned into a daughter, so that this kind of like this violence of like powerful men against kind of like women in this system of violence was made more apparent. Which, you know, didn't change a single line in the script except for maybe a couple pronoun switches, and um, added just a whole new level of it. Which is why, again, circling back, I think Shakespeare is so timeless because it's so adaptable and it is so just human. That's why I loved it so much. That's why I love Shakespeare. Like, because like I started learning about Shakespeare because my dad would make me memorize lines from Midsummer's Night's Dream, and I was like, this sucks. I hate this. It's old and I don't get it. And then I would like watch the Macbeth movie with Sir Patrick Stewart in my freshman year English class, and I would be like, this is tea. Like, this is so exciting. Like, this is like, it's so dramatic and it's so cool. It's so cool. If you have a dictionary in your hand and you understand it as you read it and you reread the same thing 5 times. But it is really cool. Um, but in terms of adaptation, I think that it's an interesting like theater process, and also I just think it's kind of unique to Shakespeare.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I guess you guys really kind of addressed this in speaking to Macbeth specifically. First of all, Ella, that's so interesting. I'm really annoyed now that I didn't see the show, that you like recast the characters. I feel like I should give that context. Like I'm interviewing you guys about this. I didn't actually see it, sorry.
It's okay. No hard feelings. No hard feelings.
Well, it's not hard feeling.
I wish I
I'm
could
kidding, I'm kidding, I'm kidding.
next time I'm in the audience, I swear. Next time you direct a show.
Yeah.
But I guess to sort of wrap things up, what place do you think that Shakespeare has in like modern theater spaces? Do you feel like it's given, I don't know, too much attention, and that to the like suffering of more modern shows? Or Ella's screaming no, so I guess take it away. Tell me why.
Okay, I do think that there is an argument to be made that we should be doing contemporary things. Um, but like kind of what Chance said was and you said this too, Olivia, like the reason that Shakespeare was so popular and has continued to be so popular, like first of all, that is an unprecedented career trajectory, by the way.
Mhm.
Let's talk about that because it's actually absurd how relevant and how much he's stuck around and how many people have studied him. Like I can't even I took the class that Chance took in the winter. I took that in the fall. And my professor would talk about like people, I think Hamlet has been read like probably millions of times.
Mm.
And that is just insane to me. But the reason is because he was so ahead of his time. And you see that in all of his work. You see that in Othello, Twelfth Night, Hamlet, um, Macbeth. Like it's almost you mentioned that theory about how people thought that it was more than one person because how could one guy just
Mhm.
be so insanely smart and able to do all these amazing things, and write all this amazing work. I think that there's definitely an argument to be made that we should keep up with the times and keep doing things that are poignant, but I think Shakespeare has been around for so long and has been so relevant and popular because for a reason. And there's always a way to make it new and always a way to bring it into a modern context. Right now the play that I'm in with UW Drama is called Thrive or What You Will, and it's written by L.M. Feldman, and it's not based off of Twelfth Night, but it has a lot of like, it's pulled a lot from Twelfth Night because it's about another woman who dressed up as a man to circumnavigate the globe and find work, just like uh, Viola does in Twelfth Night.
Yeah.
And so it's just like you see life reflecting art and art reflecting life, and Shakespeare is like a timeless example of that. And so I think like keep doing it. It's so good, and it's good every time. Even like the worst production of high school Shakespeare that you've ever seen, it's impactful, it's important, and it's a huge part of culture that like people should explore more. Not necessarily like just theater people too. I think like going to Shakespeare and like pushing yourself to try to understand that and try to comprehend what they're actually saying, like that's huge.
Thank you guys so much. I want to give you a chance to say anything, any other last thoughts about Shakespeare, about adaptations, about, I don't know, stuff you're in upcoming. I know Ella mentioned Thrive. If you want to give any sponsored ads for the listeners of the TeenTix pod, go ahead.
One final thought about Shakespeare's relevance. I would like to mention that Shakespeare did not write his plays in order to be the greatest poet of all time. He wrote them to sell tickets. And the original, like everyone's heard of like well, not everyone, but we talked about it at the start of the podcast, the Macbeth curse. If you say his name, it'll bring bad luck to your theater. A possible origin for that superstition is that Macbeth was such a good and popular play at the time of its writing, is that if you uttered its name, your play would get swept out of the theater and get replaced with Macbeth. And, you know, there was a lot of possible futures where Shakespeare's collected works got burned. But at the end of the day, it's not like people trying to shove this academic thing down your throats. It is really amazing, super timeless stories. And of course, you know, theater evolves and stories evolve. Like there will never not be a place for a contemporary theater. And there will also never not be a place for things like Chekhov or things like Shakespeare, which show a different time in history, but the same human elements that kind of tie us all together.
Oh, that was beautifully said. I'm gonna get that tattooed on my arm. Ella,
The whole thing?
Yep, the whole thing. Actually, I'm gonna put it on my whole back. Yeah.
I mean, not much from me. I think come out and support college theater. This is the thing too, is like we did this production with like $900, no budget. We were in like a classroom in our building, and like,
and it was still the greatest Shakespeare adaptation you will ever see.
It was still awesome. But what I will say is like, please come out and see our shows. Like, we're at the UW and we're just doing theater just to do theater, and it's like
all the time.
All the time. There's so much going on all the time. So come out and see a show. We got Thrive coming up in the spring. They're all happening at the same time too. Like literally in 2 weeks, they're all going up. Yeah.
Yes,
so
Amelie.
Olivia and Chance are in Amelie with Stage Notes. That's the musical theater RSO. UTS, the place that I directed McBee in and that Chance was in, they're doing 2 different shows. They're doing Proof and The Importance of Being Earnest this spring. And UW Drama has their own show called Thrive, which you should definitely go and see as well. So that's all I'm going to say. That's my promo.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate you talking with me today, and I really feel like I gained something from this conversation, and I hope our listeners did as well.
Thank you.
In this interview, I'll be speaking with Anna Klein, Education Director at Seattle Shakespeare Company, to hear about her background with and thoughts on Shakespeare adaptations. I guess I'll start with what is your favorite Shakespeare play and favorite Shakespeare adaptation? And this adaptation can be like film or otherwise like play adaptations, and kind of what draws you to them like separately.
Yeah. I mean, choosing a favorite Shakespeare play is obviously really hard. Romeo and Juliet is the nearest and dearest to my heart because it's the play that made me fall in love with Shakespeare when I was young. And it was the focus of my college thesis in 2020. So I spent a lot of time kind of working with that text, and I have a lot of love for those characters. And I think that the message is so poignant in the way that it really focuses on what happens when society doesn't listen to young people and the consequences of that. And that is a story that is told over and over again, and we see it every day in our society. And I think that's really special. But there's also like Much Ado About Nothing, which has such clever wordplay and really interesting character dynamics. And I'm really fond of King Lear because of the way it talks about grief and power. And Richard II is probably my favorite history play. So it kind of depends on my mood and the day. But there's just so much exciting work in the Shakespearean canon. So I'm a big fan of a lot of it.
Mhm.
And in terms of adaptations, that's a great question. I think if you're looking at like direct Shakespeare adaptations, my favorite is probably West Side Story. I love the like musical collaboration that happened between Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim. It's such exciting music, and the way that they translate all of those emotions into a war of class and territory, I think is just really intriguing. But I really love like written content that's inspired by Shakespeare, even if it's not a direct adaptation. Things like Station 11 and If We Were Villains. Um, they're really excellent examples of books that use Shakespeare as like a narrative framework, but they tell the story of a Shakespearean nature, but they're not a direct depiction of a certain play. So I think those are probably my favorites.
Wow, those are a lot of great examples. Yeah. I especially really like King Lear as well. Actually, we just like a few months ago in my AP literature class, we studied King Lear, and then we also got to make our own kind of little adaptation where in a group we basically like adapted it to a new time. So ours was like it's set in a high school where King Lear is the principal of the high school, and he's kind of going insane. So that was really fun. I really liked working with it that way. It's like our own little mini adaptation, and I feel like it just gives so much of a deeper understanding of Shakespeare when you're able to like put it in new contexts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I King Lear was the one I did, I think, my senior year of high school, which
Mhm.
I mean, I played Regan, which was a really fun villain to like
Yeah.
tackle and I don't know, gouge somebody's eyes out on stage was so
Yeah.
brutal and exciting. Yeah, it's a great script.
For sure. So could you share a little bit about your personal experience with adapting Shakespeare, whether that's through like acting in a play that was adapted Shakespeare, or maybe even directing, or even just like viewing? And basically like what insights or takeaways did you gain from like those processes and
Yeah,
experience?
yeah, great questions. I think Shakespeare is incredibly malleable, and his works are, as you noticed in your high school class, probably they're just so endlessly adaptable based on who's telling the story and where they're telling the story and when they're telling the story. So every production can feel so different, and it reflects the values of the creative team and the directors and the cast. Um, we work with here at Seattle Shakespeare a program called Youth Shakes, um, which we take the same script that the adult professional cast is working on, and a youth ensemble performs the same play. But that's the only baseline is we take the same script and do our own version of the same play, and we perform on the same stage. But the way in which those productions can look and feel so different because the people telling the story are so different is just so remarkably special. And then they get to kind of interact with their adult counterparts and talk about the discoveries that they've made in those characters, which can look and feel so different, which I just think is so brilliant and cool. I think working with young people, especially with Shakespeare, has been so eye-opening and exciting. A couple years ago, I had a student who was directing their first Shakespeare play, and I was kind of stepping into a mentorship role, just kind of making sure that they had all the resources they need. But they took a production of Twelfth Night and talked about their queer experience and the relationship that uh, they saw in the play between safety and authenticity. And I thought that that was just such a beautiful take on that play. And it was so personal to the way that they experienced life and therefore the way they experienced that script, which was just so lovely to watch and watch them kind of translate that with their group of actors. It just like filled my heart with so much warmth. Did that
Yeah.
answer the question?
Yeah, perfect. Because I've never thought about it that way, like in the way where you're adapting Shakespeare based on, like, if you're an actor, your personal experiences and kind of how that brings a new dimension to the character you're playing or the play you're like directing. So that was really great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hmm. And in your view, how do you think like stage adaptations of Shakespeare might differ from those like on screen, like in movies or, TV shows? And which medium do you think that you personally prefer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably always going to lean towards stage productions because it's where I first fell in love with Shakespeare. And there's something so magical about performing something live because you're telling a whole narrative story from beginning to end. And as an actor, that's really grounding because once you start that play, that's a roller coaster that you don't get off until the very end. So you get to really follow that narrative story. Whereas if you're a performer performing a Shakespeare play on screen, you might perform your final monologue before you film the first scene. And so slicing that up can be a different type of experiencing that text. I think there's some really excellent modern screen adaptations, like She's the Man, which is Twelfth Night, and like 10 Things I Hate About You, which is Taming of the Shrew. And there was that Sydney Sweeney one that came out pretty recently. I think it's called Anyone But You. It was a modern adaptation of Much Ado. And I think those are like really funny and accessible and like digestible ways to kind of gateway into Shakespeare. Um, but I love stage work. I do have I think some screen adaptations of Shakespeare really, really work. I also have some screen adaptations that I really don't like. Like, I will be controversial and say that I really hate the 1990s Baz Luhrmann Romeo and Juliet, but some people love it. And, who am I to yuck their yum, so to speak? But in that adaptation, one of the things that Baz Luhrmann does is he intercuts Juliet's monologues with things that Romeo's doing. And that's one of the things that bugs me is like in Shakespeare's work, traditionally, you get that whole piece of her text and her emotion without, you know, cutting in and out. Um, and so I think it's just really exciting to watch that live and unfold in real time. And it always kind of irked me because I was like, let her speak. But yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I definitely think that, changing the narratives with the different formats can impact, how the story flows and kind of what emotions that it evokes.
Yeah.
So I wanted to, talk about something that you mentioned earlier. You kind of said that Shakespeare's works are malleable in a way. So, like, why do you think that in like, piggybacking off of that, why do you think that Shakespeare's works have remained so, adaptable and relevant or like you said, malleable across time?
Yeah. I mean, his plays ask and sometimes try to answer the big questions that we still grapple with today about love and loss and power and politics. And by adapting and still performing Shakespeare, we're not trying to make it modern. We're just showing that all of those themes are still things that we feel today. Um, his language is also just it's unlike anything else that we have in media nowadays. Like he encoded secret messages into the meter of his language. He emphasizes certain words specifically based on the rhythm of the syllables. And he didn't bother with stage directions because he encoded it into how that character speaks so you can tell how they're breathing or what they're feeling just based on the meter of language. And so when you take that and you look at his language, it's so powerful and rich and layered and so emotionally precise that once you've learned it, you you've built like a set of skills that apply to so many different types of texts. Everything from like contemporary plays to poetry and even academic writing becomes more accessible because you've kind of learned to analyze text in a new way once you've kind of cracked the code of Shakespeare, which I think is also a part of why we still look at it and understand it. I also think that Shakespeare may have had just tremendous foresight I don't know if this is true, but like one of my favorite things that happens in the play As You Like It is at the very end of the play, Rosalind has this monologue where she comes back on stage and she's like, "Isn't it weird that I was on stage pretending to be a man, pretending to be a woman, and all of you were just in love with me this whole time?" And back in Shakespeare's day, because women weren't traditionally on stage, it was a young man playing the role of a young woman who was playing the role of a young man pretending to be a young woman, which is so layered. But then
Wow.
when you strip away that extra layer and actually have a woman saying that monologue, it feels really different. So he had this ability to write text that could be adapted when spoken by new voices, and I think that's part of the reason it works is it takes on new meaning based on who's saying those words and when they're saying those words.
Yeah, absolutely. That was really insightful. And I especially agree with the part you said about like answering the big questions that we still have today. Like, I feel like the themes in his plays are so universal and they kind of like apply to everyone. Like, you'll end up relating to one theme or another in his plays, I definitely feel like.
Absolutely. I think everybody can find at least one thing in Shakespeare that they're like, oh yeah, no, that's definitely true for me.
Exactly. Yeah. So at Seattle Shakespeare, how do you, like balance those traditional elements of his work? Like you said, like the language is so different. And like even the themes can be like a little bit hard to, translate because they look different, in the past and how they are now. So how do you kind of balance those traditional elements of language and themes with modern interpretations that are like needed for adaptations?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I always like to say to students is Shakespeare is so dead. Like, he's so dead. He's not going to rise from the grave and have an opinion on what we're doing. And while it's flowery language, it's not sacred language. And so we can use it however we want. And it's in the public domain. So if we want to remove things or change words, that is all within our ability to do. And I think that because that we get to challenge the text instead of blindly accepting it. Shakespeare has this, Seattle Shakespeare specifically has this like slogan that Shakespeare is for everyone, which I think is incredibly true. But we specifically try to take Shakespeare's text and make sure that it speaks to everyone. And so we challenge that text and put people in roles that maybe they didn't necessarily see themselves in because we can reevaluate how that text functions for an actor or within a certain scene. And you can move scenes around. You can put a scene from the end and move it a little more towards the middle to tell a different story. Or recently in a production of Romeo and Juliet we did, there's a moment in which Juliet is talking to the nurse and Romeo's talking to the friar, and they just intercut those scenes so that they're having those conversations back to back and happening at the same time. And there's something really lovely about the ability to do that and the ability to rework text in a way that really speaks to the actors. Um, Obviously, Shakespeare is incredibly traditional, but like I said, so much of that language is true. And there's so many phrases and slogans and words that we use nowadays that we don't even know. Like knock knock jokes were invented by Shakespeare, which is a crazy fun fact that even boggles my mind. But I think there's so much that we think is modern that was actually derived from Shakespeare's work. So taking those themes, those ideas, that language, and making it our own and giving ourselves permission to play with it and not feel like it's something holy or sacred that we need to, pay homage to. That's, I mean, that's part of the work is just making it our own and having fun and acknowledging that Shakespeare is dead and this is ours now. And I think that's part of the reason it's so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely true when you think of, Shakespeare as like an art that's always evolving and, changing to fit the current needs and like what people want to see and how they, the current themes in the world, especially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm. Well, that's all the questions that I had for you today. Thank you so
Okay.
much for all those really great answers. Lots of good
Yeah.
information. Yeah, thank you.
Amazing.
This was the TeenTix Arts Podcast. Thank you for listening. We hope this will encourage you to check out some Shakespeare adaptations. Thank you to everyone behind the scenes who helped make this happen.